That's why we're singing this song. Yeah, are there any raging grannies in the audience? You want to wave, Rebecca? That's their brand new song. So, I want to say hi and welcome. We're so glad you're here to join us for our 7th Rumble on the River. I'm Margaret Butler. I spent 40 years in the labor movement here in Portland, and then have been working with Extinction Rebellion and Climate Jobs PDX for the last 4 years. I want to start us out with an original people's acknowledgement. We are gathered here on stolen land, focused on issues that are a consequence of 500 years of colonization, attempted genocide of indigenous peoples, theft, and broken promises. We acknowledge the peoples who have lived here for tens of thousands of years. The Portland metro area rests on traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River, living in right relationship with the land and the water, and knowing themselves to be part of the web of life. These original peoples continue to steward the land and work for a return of that right relationship. We commit ourselves to support them and work to repair the damage as we do our work. I want to say thank you to First Unitarian Church for hosting us. Got the right. It's not. Oh, back one. Okay. And to all of our co-sponsors, which we're going to read them out just to say thank you properly. 350 PDX, the Braided River Campaign, the Breach Collective, Cathedral Park Neighborhood Association, CedarAction, Columbia Riverkeeper, the Cully Association of Neighbors, EcoFaith Recovery, Extinction Rebellion PDX, First Unitarian Church, the Linnton Neighborhood Association, Havurah Climate Action Team, Human Access Project, Neighbors for Clean Air, the Oregon chapter of the Sierra Club, the Oregon Conservancy Foundation, Oregon Physicians for Social Responsibility, P.E.S.T Projection, Portland Audubon, Portland Harbor Community Advisory Group, Portland Harbor Community Coalition, Portland Jobs with Justice, Portland Raging Grannies, Portland Youth Climate Council, Portland Youth Climate Strike, Portsmouth Neighborhood Association, St. John's Neighborhood Association, the Sunrise Movement-PDX, and Willamette Riverkeeper. How's that for a beginning? Yeah. Starting to tackle this big problem. Yeah. Okay, now I'm going to give a little bit of background on the Critical Energy Infrastructure Hub and Zenith. For people who are new, a lot of you are not, but some are, and because this rumble is going to be a little bit different with more focus on movement building and less on information about the two targets. So, Sue?
Magic fingers.
I have no blood in my fingers. Yeah, go back to the video. This this is Jay Wilson's flyover video of the critical energy infrastructure hub, and I'm going to talk a little bit as it plays. So, the critical energy infrastructure hub is a strip of land 6 miles long, which lies between Forest Park and the Willamette River in northwest Portland. The land itself is mostly infill from dredging the ship channel. There were lakes and wetlands where the tank farms now stand. 90% of Oregon's fuel is stored on this unstable land, which would liquefy in the event of a major earthquake. It's only in the last few years that government entities have started to look at the serious danger and take some steps. Senate Bill 1567 passed in 2022 and requires assessment of conditions of the tank and seismic upgrades to the tanks. This is a small step, but it's not nearly adequate for what we face. One of the 11 companies in the critical energy infrastructure hub is Zenith Energy. Zenith is a Texas company that bought an old asphalt facility in 2017. In 2019, Zenith used a grandfathered construction permit to expand unloading capacity, moving from being able to handle 12 rail cars at a time to 44. This was despite the city of Portland's policy against expanding fossil fuel infrastructure. Many people have been working to get Zenith shut down for at least 4 years with various complementary strategies. None of Zenith's oil is used in our community. It's only brought in by rail and shipped out to refineries elsewhere on the West Coast or to Asia. In 2021, we thought we had a big victory when the city of Portland refused to give Zenith a land use compatibility statement, a necessary step for renewing an air quality permit. In October of last year, the city reversed itself and in a backroom deal with no public process, granted the land use compatibility statement based on Zenith's commitment to go to 100% renewables in 5 years. Right. Yes. The number of trains immediately increased, and it's all crude oil coming in. Scientists tell us we don't have 5 more years of increasing the use of fossil fuels, and there are many questions about renewables. So we have been doing these community forums since last October, really trying to build a movement big enough to tackle what's going on here. And I'll move on if I can get the slides to function. Sue's our helper when we need her. Oh, that's too far. Okay, this is one of the issues with Zenith. Bringing in stuff by rail has so much danger to it. I wanted you to have that information because, like I said, we're going to focus on other parts of the movement, mostly tonight. And we are on a really tight time frame. We hope to have some question and answers at the end, but you may need to ask the panelists questions on their way out the door. We'll see how we do staying on time. And now I'm really excited to introduce our panel. We have Jay Wilson, who did the flyover video, emergency management, seismic. And then we'll hear from Dan Sears from Columbia Riverkeeper, who's going to talk about a lot of the issues on the river, not just the CEI Hub. And then we're really lucky to have Sterling Stokes, the campaign manager with Portland Harbor Community Coalition, who's going to talk about the gaps in our movement and how we move forward on that. And finally, we'll have Ben Stevenson from Sunrise PDX talking about the vision we need to have and a little bit about Sunrise's work on Zenith. I'm really excited about this, and I'll turn it over to Jay.
Get this all rolling. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out on a wonderful spring, cool, cloudy day, Portland style. So what I'm here to show you is the premiere tonight of a video that I feel very lucky to have produced in the last few weeks. I interview a marine biologist who's retired from the NOAA oil spill response based out of Seattle. He worked in his first job with them on the Exxon Valdez spill, and I
So the Exxon Valdez released around 11 million gallons of oil. Our role at that point was to independently assess the short-term biological effects. Meanwhile, the group that I eventually became a part of was trying to map out the extent of the oil spill spread, both on the shorelines and on the water, and determine really where the oil was going to go and what kinds of habitats within Prince William Sound and outside of Prince William Sound were going to be impacted by the spread of the oil. Well, there were many media portrayals of the very visible and visceral wildlife impacts to sea otters, to harbor seals, certainly to birds. Anything that frequents the surface of the water always gets very heavily impacted, and those are the most heartrending images that you really see from a large oil spill. And now you're talking about an even greater volume of oil potentially being released into a much more confined and constricted environment. And like I said, that's almost, it's almost impossible to fathom what that would be like. Off-gassing of volatile hydrocarbons from something like gasoline or diesel oil is going to be noticeable. I mean, when crude oil spills, you can smell it, and it can make people sick. And certainly things like gasoline are going to be much more so. And we always worry about gasoline because there is an explosive risk, and oftentimes there won't be much of a response at all because it's just too risky to try to bring equipment in. If there's any spark in a confined area or in a pocket of gasoline vapors, then that's really a big danger to the responder. Presence of a diesel oil on the water in a riverine environment introduces the potential for it mixing, because diesel mixes quite naturally with water, just with a little bit of wind or wave action. So you may get water or oil in the water column that's being carried downstream. You're exposing animals and plants in the water column or on the bottom because gasoline and diesel tend to mix a little bit more into the water than things like crude oil. So you're going to increase the toxicity of the water column if you have some of those lighter refined products that are released into this kind of a system. And so that's why during an oil spill, we often are quite concerned about the accumulation of petroleum hydrocarbons in the tissues of clams and mussels and other things that we might eat, or the food items that birds and other mammals might be eating. Sunken oil, especially in a riverine environment, is going to be a big issue because, as should be obvious, rivers are not static environments. They're extremely dynamic, both tidally influenced and by varying river flows. So trying to determine where oil is in a riverine environment is going to be very difficult. My professional opinion is that if you can prevent the oil from entering the river, that's your best solution. Is that possible? It's going to be expensive if these tank farms are going to be upgraded, but that certainly is a lot cheaper than cleaning up after the fact. If we follow the template for almost any other catastrophic, large-scale disaster, not necessarily just an oil spill, but something like a hurricane or a natural disaster like an earthquake, then the first priority is going to be life and safety of people. It's going to be search and rescue. It's going to be, the Coast Guard isn't going to be thinking about oil spill response. They're going to be thinking about rescuing people from their homes or taking them off of roofs or off of ships and other rescues that need to take place just for the sake of the community. Then much, much, much farther down the list is, okay, we've got people safe, we have people working on repairing the infrastructure. Now let's think about the environmental impacts of what's just happened. And unfortunately, that's going to take place well after whatever initial impacts there might be. It might be weeks, it might be months before people think about, well, we have these tank farms and now they've cut loose their contents, and what happened to all of that oil, and what are the effects, and how do we mediate that? It's going to be well after the fact. And normally, we in the spill response community like to get on things right away. You know, the sooner the better. So in the aftermath of a large earthquake, I don't think we're going to have that opportunity. In the business of oil spill response, prevention and preparedness are always preferable, because once you let the genie out of the bottle, once you squeeze the toothpaste out of the tube, it's really hard to push it back in again. One of the many outcomes from Exxon Valdez was that we launched a long-term monitoring project to look at some of those very intrusive shoreline cleanup techniques, like the use of high-pressure hot water on the shorelines, to evaluate whether we were inflicting more harm than we really thought we were. And the short answer was that it did appear that the high-pressure hot water inflicted more damage on the shoreline by cooking things, by basically sterilizing the habitat, than would have been the case by leaving the oil. Certainly the productivity of the shorelines, especially where the oil was most obviously encountered, the productivity there was reduced immediately and for at least a few years, maybe 3 years or so, but it did recover eventually. So that was a good lesson for us to be aware of in the future when we see what appears to be really devastating impacts on the shoreline. Thankfully, Mother Nature has a capacity of resilience and the ability to recover. You know, we think that we're helping it along by doing the cleanup that we do, and you know, maybe we do, maybe we don't, but I think it's mostly the resilience of nature itself that really accelerates recovery on the shoreline. maybe there's some compromise in terms of trying to improve preparedness for these structures, and hoping that we can accelerate our weaning of from petroleum products and switching to alternative sources of energy, so that we don't have to worry about having hundreds of millions of gallons on the Willamette River here. So.
Someone who's an authority in this area have a very strong position of his experience, his observations here, and his concerns professionally about what's going to happen, and to inform us, because I don't think there's been a lot of discussion in this arena so far to really lay out the nature of how bad this bill is going to impact the environment. And also the fact that there is a high unlikelihood that we won't have much, if any, of a spill response to depend on, to plan for. And then the aspects of recovery that are really complicated in the nature of the river and the nature of all those chemicals that are going to be in the river. So the fact that he's advocating the way that he does, I think I'm hoping this becomes a useful tool in the community who are working on this to take it and leverage it for the purposes that we're all here for tonight. This is the concluding slide from an earlier presentation, but I just wanted to hit a few points. The code and standards that are currently being considered for the upgrades or for new construction, we still don't have adequate building codes in this country for 4 minutes of strong ground shaking. Most of our codes are based on California-style earthquakes that shake strongly, but only for tens of seconds. What we really need is to find a way to leverage the seismic risk to get us to our greenhouse gas goals that we have for 2035 and 2050. It's not just an engineering problem to engineer our way out of this. We need a policy vision that brokers bringing down the seismic risk, but to get us to where we need to be with our greenhouse gas reductions and not having to store so much oil on the river. I want to just have a few points from Yumei Wang, who was at our last Rumble on the River. She's working at PSU now, and she's formerly from the Department of Geology and was the lead author of the 2013 study. She's helping to lead outreach to our Congress, our congressional representatives that are here in this area, and urging all of us to reach out to our federal delegates. We'd like to install seismic early warning systems to help manage the facilities and the staff as best we can. We need to advocate for increased fire measures in Forest Park in case there is an ignition, to help the forest not become collateral damage if we have an ignition in the CEI Hub. And then she's urging to increase our spill response capacities. And I'll just say, I attended a regional meeting at the U.S. Coast Guard facility on Swan Island a little over a month ago, where they were reviewing their annual spill contingency planning for the Lower Columbia River. And I directly asked, is there a CEI Hub worst case scenario in your plans? Because they had an entire section on their worst case scenario spills. And they said no. And every worst case scenario they had was at a single facility for an anticipated release, like a truck accident, like a pipeline break, but nothing that addressed this. And they said, and very politely, if you want us to consider that, here's a form you can fill out. Turn it in by August, and we'll consider it next year. And to me, it's just mortifying that this isn't on their radar, and this is where the state and all the federal agencies work together on this. And so, thinking we have a spill capacity is a moot point. And so, the only protection that we really are going to have for the river, for the future, it's whatever design standards anything that's being built out of Senate Bill 1567 is going to have. And I'm urging, one, that the oil companies need to decentralize their concentration of storage capacity here. It's in their best interest not to have 90% of all of their assets on some of the worst ground in the whole state. And that also, we only should be focusing on building new transitional oil storage as opposed to retrofitting old oil storage. It's not cost effective and it's really not going to perform like they expect. Thank you.
And now we'll hear from Dan.
All right. I think I've got a few slides.
Your touches.
Which button? There we go. Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. I'm Dan Sears with the Columbia Riverkeeper, and it's an honor to be here with this panel and with all of you. Raise your hand if you've been to a hearing about a fossil fuel project. All right. This is quite a group. Because of your work, because of the advocacy of people in this room and people you're connected with, most of the projects listed up here, which were a smattering of gas, coal, propane, crude oil, liquefied natural gas, refineries, chemical plants, you name it, those things didn't happen. And so for 2 decades, the first time I was in a meeting here was with someone from the east coast of Russia dealing with an LNG export facility. He said, if I can give you one piece of advice, don't let it happen. Don't let them get established, because once they're there, they're impossible to get rid of. And that's where we find ourselves with Zenith. And that's one of the challenges I'm going to talk about in a couple places on the river. So I'm going to give a long and meandering talk here about all the terrible things that are going on. But the first thing I wanted to say was this, which is a thank you to everyone here for your long advocacy. I also want to say, if not for people in this room, we wouldn't even be talking about a shutdown date for Zenith for crude oil, but I'll talk about what might be coming next. I'll just keep pressing it until it jumps. I'll keep talking as well. Oh, I skipped a minute ahead. Okay, so this is the picture that we've already seen, and Jay covered this really well. I just want to reiterate one point, which is DEQ is going to be doing a rulemaking around how to mitigate these risks. And already on the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, Sterling was there, Nancy Heiser from Linnton Community Association, or Neighborhood Association was there, and there are gaps in how to mitigate this risk, one of which, and I'll speak about, is the risk to the Columbia River estuary. When Sora Savage was proposing North America's largest oil train terminal in Vancouver, they tried to argue that oil spills were good for jobs. And some people in this room wore hazmat suits and showed up at the hearing to make a point how stupid that was. So at least now, the industries are acknowledging that there's a problem. They would like to not talk about having to remove tanks. And that's a point that Nancy, for instance, made very well, is that removal has to be on the table. And the reason, not just click, and eventually I'll skip too ahead.
I think it's just a little delayed. So
Okay. There we go. So as you see, I'm going to talk about a bunch of stuff.
Previews.
So one of the things that's common to Zenith and other problems in the Columbia River estuary is this idea that Zenith will transition to renewable fuels. And I just want to be real about it. In 5 years, if what you have is a train terminal running quote unquote renewable diesel or renewable naphtha, which is kerosene, it's like lighter fluid. Kate Murphy has been reviewing their air permit application that's going to be coming up for comment. She can speak more knowledgeably than I can. But just a general heads up that the off-ramp for Zenith and these projects can't be just simply storing different types of toxic flammable fuel. Because the spills there will be just as potentially harmful. So I'm going to zoom downriver and talk about a place called Port Westward, which is marked in the blue up there. It's an incredible spot on the Columbia River, a big deep bend. You might know it because there was a project there called Global Partners that was pulling oil trains through Portland a few years back. They've since switched to renewable diesel, quote unquote renewable diesel. So what is renewable diesel? Well, first of all, they proposed to make a company called Next 750 million gallons of it right there in that bend in the Columbia River, which shows up bright red for the amount of shaking that will happen in an earthquake, in a place with soil that's going to be jelly in an earthquake. It's deep peat soil, no bedrock, hundreds of feet deep. So everything you see in the critical energy infrastructure hub in terms of horrible siting, putting very dangerous infrastructure on very unstable soil, the state of Oregon is actively considering making the same mistake at Port Westward and has already issued permits for this. Not all the permits needed, but some of them. And so the community there is pushing back. Renewable diesel is chemically basically just diesel. It's made out of other stuff. We've taken to calling this project non-conventional diesel. And so this whole stretch is the Columbia River estuary. This is the linchpin for protecting and restoring salmon for the entire Columbia River. So when we talk about removing dams or not, the reasons they give for not removing them is that this area of the estuary is so intact, this is going to prop up all these runs until we get to managing the dams correctly. So it's all interconnected. The community in Linnton, the community in Portland Harbor, Community Coalition has had an incredible impact on changing the conversation, putting Zenith on the map. The same is going on at Port Westward. It's a very different community. It's a farming community. This is a farmer teaching other people in his community about how the dikes work that protect where this giant refinery would be that would make 750 million gallons of diesel in the Columbia River estuary and store over 1 million barrels of diesel and feedstock. So these community members are kind of up against it. The people we partnered with to stop oil, to stop liquefied natural gas, to stop coal, and now they're being left very much like Portland Harbor to fend off, these new quote-unquote renewable projects that don't have the benefits thought. So these are just 4 images depicting this area, and there'll be more coming on this later this summer and fall. Those are blueberry fields in the upper left. A lot of the blueberries grown in this place are organic. That's where they get their water, on the upper right. If there was ever an earthquake or a spill of any kind, that water would get polluted, which means all the irrigation water and the water systems for this whole 6,000 acre swath of land would be contaminated, thus ending at least some of these farmers' operations. This is a spill of renewable diesel on the Highway 30 corridor where this train car was leaking out of the bottom. It required a hazmat response for a relatively small amount of diesel leaked. And this is a community of Buddhists who live in the Great Vow Zen Monastery, right across the road from the proposed refinery. And they've become very organized. If you ever want to hear some incredible testimony, hear it from people who spend their days meditating, looking at the site.
Get the white one might work.
Try the white one.
Oh, right, there we go.
Great. There you go. Okay. And now I'm going to zoom out a little bit about why it's so important and why these challenges are so significant. First, this is an issue that I think captures a little bit of what Jay's video talked about, the difficulty of getting contamination out of a river once it's been there. For decades, the federal government dumped highly contaminated waste at a place called Bradford Island. So we're not thinking about these risks in isolation. We have already massive contaminated sites. Portland Harbor Community Coalition has brought thousands of people together to deal with the Portland Harbor contamination, but it's not alone. This spot on the Columbia River has absolutely freak show levels of PCBs. I mean, just huge levels. Like I thought they were a mistake when I first read them. Tens of thousands of parts per billion when the standard is a fraction of that.
Where's Ruckle Creek? Is that on there?
Yeah, it's on the Oregon side. It comes out very close to, this is very close to Bonneville Dam. Oh yeah, it's marked there.
Just above the Nations Fort.
So I've got one more. Something that's common to Bradford Island, this is on the Columbia River with Portland Harbor Community. Portland Harbor as a cleanup site is fish advisories. And so the next slide will be about fish advisories on the Columbia River, which says, for many fish in this area, they're simply not safe to eat. There is an advisory, just don't eat them, resident fish. And this place isn't alone on the Columbia. So actually this is good. I'll just skip ahead, given the time, and talk. You know, Bradford Island, because of these PCB levels, is a huge cleanup challenge. It's going to take decades. It's already taken decades. Yakima Nation had brought attention to this and got this listed as a Superfund site. You might not think that's great news, but it compels cleanup. And right now, Yakima Nation has just told the federal government that they intend to sue them if they don't proceed with the cleanup as promised and more rapidly. So one thing, you know, we had an acknowledgement at the very beginning. From the very beginning of these cleanup efforts and these mitigation efforts, the tribes of the Columbia River have had an enormous impact in drawing attention to the burdens that are placed on tribal communities who can't eat the fish, on immigrant communities who rely on this for protein, on environmental justice communities up and down the river who face enormous risks from these places. And to put this on a super grand scale, the Columbia River has the most contaminated place in the Western Hemisphere, known as the Hanford nuclear site. For folks who aren't familiar with it, this is where 2/3 of the plutonium was made for our nuclear weapon arsenal in the United States. And it remains fantastically contaminated with radioactive and chemical pollution. And so, again, when we try to think about protecting these rivers from added contamination, it's very, very, very important to not contribute more to the burdens already on the river. And this is a place where I really wanted to highlight again the impact that tribes have had. If not for the engagement of tribes, this would be a dump site right now for high-level nuclear waste. If not for engagement from community groups like are represented in this room, it would be a dump site. The reason why there's been so much groundwater cleanup at Hanford that really has reduced the amount that's reaching the Columbia River is because of community engagement. So when you have an opportunity to weigh in these DEQ meetings or to get more engaged in Hanford cleanup, you can really have an impact. And I'll just want to say, I really just don't want people to forget about Hanford. That's part of the reason I wanted to add this in. It's going to take generations more. And when I joined the Hanford Advisory Board years ago, I was like one of the very few people under 30. And just last week, or 2 weeks ago, Yakima Nation staff brought 2 buses of tribal school students through the Hanford site to teach them, their own young people, how to engage in this cleanup and how to be involved in protecting the cultural and natural resources that are so vital. This was a place where people lived and wintered. Thousands of people lived across the Hanford site. And, I'll just keep talking about it. Right now, we're at a really critical juncture in cleanup for Hanford. The U.S. Department of Energy has come to some type of agreement, I won't say what, with the state of Washington about how to deal with some of the worst radioactive waste ever made. This stuff sits in tanks in the middle of the Hanford site, what's called the 200 area. And the reason why there's been an agreement to try to turn this into glass to keep it immobilized is, again, because of community pressure. It was over 10 years ago that hundreds of people turned out to hearings about the Hanford nuclear site. And it was a whole generation before me that stopped this site from becoming a nuclear waste dump. So the big picture, one more ahead, because I love this piece.
I'm going to just be your partner.
Thank you. Yeah, one more. The last image. The stakes are super high. And so this is one facility that just had a fire a couple months ago that caused an evacuation. There's enough radioactivity, it's comparable to Chernobyl, the single building. And what you see there is actual glowing water. These are cesium and strontium capsules in a pool of water that if an earthquake strikes near Hanford, this building could very possibly fall apart. And that water will leak, and those capsules will rupture, and that radiation will spread over a large area, ending cleanup at Hanford. So the stakes, these challenges that we deal with in fuel tanks on Portland Harbor, and digging PCBs out of Bradford Island, or trying to find ways to take these capsules out and get them into dry storage, these are massive challenges just in cleanup. So when we hear about plans to double down on these mistakes through terrible siting decisions, like putting 1 million barrels of fuel and feedstock at Port Westward, or adding more tanks, or like you were saying, just trying to retrofit tanks sitting on jelly soil in Portland Harbor, it's a huge mistake. And so our engagement has really been one of the few bulwarks against these problems getting worse. And now the real last slide. I just love this piece of art. There is a great, if you want to learn more about Hanford or share information about it, there's something called Waters Walk Through Hanford. It's a story map. And an artist named Tri Cheatham did these beautiful illustrations showing the different ways in which people work to get contamination out of the water, and also the way contamination flows through our environment. Their work really was an inspiration to us. So thank you so much for listening. That was...
Thank you, Dan. And now we get to hear from Sterling.
Hi everyone, my name is Sterling. I use she, her pronouns. I'll just start. So I identify as and I think as we move through this movement and others and any type of advocating, it's really important to remember to ground and center ourselves and our values, because a lot of things come up and sometimes it can just be really challenging. And so just some history about me. I'm originally from Arizona. I moved here about 2.5 years ago. My dad grew up here and my grandma lives here. She's been here for over 50 years. And I used to come in the summers and it was so green and beautiful, and that's why I moved here. And my dad warned me about the rain because he hated it, which is why he left. And then I came here and now I miss the sun a lot more than I would have realized. But the seasons are really nice. And I attended undergrad at the University of Arizona. I have a Bachelor of Science in Public Management and Policy and a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology and a minor in Philosophy, so just a bunch of social sciences thrown together. I'm currently working at Portland Harbor Community Coalition. We are an environmental justice nonprofit, and we center an equitable Willamette cleanup the Superfund site, which is projected to begin in 2025. It's supposed to take over 13 years and over $1 billion. And I'm also a graduate student at the OHSU PSU School of Public Health. I'm pursuing a master's in public health and environmental systems and human health. And I think it's really important for us as well. Part of grounding ourselves is just remembering our values and what's important to us as we move in advocacy. So I wanted to talk a little bit about vulnerability and what it means in this movement, because I think a lot of times it can be really quick and easy for us to shut off our emotions or not really process what we're feeling as things are happening. And so I think a lot of times our emotions are shaped by what's happened in the past to us, what's happening present, and what we might think could come in the future. And at times, sometimes we're triggered by biases that we have based on certain things. And a way to be vulnerable with ourselves and with each other and kind of embrace what makes us all human is to really open up to what might make you afraid and what might make you stressed and why are you defensive in certain situations, and use that to kind of drive why you're passionate about what you are, and also how to meet other people, because in these movements it's so easy to look at government or look at agencies and come up with conclusions about the types of people that work there or what they're doing, instead of connecting at the base level as the people are there, and they also have biases and they also have emotions and things that are bringing them to those spaces. And so starting off there instead of the ways that we can at times when we're triggered or frustrated or annoyed with how long things are taking and how oppression works in systems, I think that is something really important. And so also wanted to talk about Senate Bill 1567 and the public comment period that's coming up with that in June. So, as Dan mentioned, a few of us were on the rulemaking advisory.
You want the next slide? Just go ahead and say the next slide.
Sure, yeah. You can get it, no worries. Yeah, that's the slide. And so basically the public comment period starts in June. And what's really important for this period is for all of us to be aware of not only their proposed mitigation rules for the tanks, but also what holes are in them. Throughout this whole process, we really saw a lot of gaps in equity where DEQ would have an equity statement, but it was, really vague, or it was a racial equity statement. But when it comes to the types of disaster or what could happen in the case of an earthquake, there are so many different types of equity to consider. There's health equity, there's socioeconomic equity, there's resource equity, who's going to be most impacted, how are they going to respond, what resources do they need to respond, and how might that differ across communities. That's something that we really need to consider, as well as the environment. There are so many species that rely on the river and surrounding areas, and that's also part of equity, because if we're not considering that before something happens, when it happens, we're not going to be prepared. And I think that's really important to push for in these final rules and in the public comment period, along with any other things you see that are missing from whatever rules are proposed. So that's this upcoming June. And along with that, community involvement is so important. I think a lot of times we enter these spaces and people that are most impacted aren't even in the spaces, and a lot of times they didn't receive an invitation. They're unaware because their communities were reached out to, and that's injustice at the end of the day. It's not okay, and these things are impacting them sometimes more than the rest of us, and they're in different positions that they might not be able to respond as quickly or have the resources to do so. And so making sure that we are including community and most impacted community throughout all of these processes is really the only way I think we can create change that's lasting and promotes equity. And so along with that, for Portland Harbor Community Coalition, like I said, the cleanup's projected to begin around 2025, and if the fuel tanks aren't ready, they're all going to spill into the river. So much money will be wasted, so much time will be wasted, and then there's going to be another disaster and cleanup to deal with. And so that's even, why it's so important that these rules are as strong as possible and as comprehensive as possible so that the worst doesn't happen. And that's what I hope we all can push for in June. And then if we could go to the next slide, thank you. So I wanted to open up for group discussion, maybe about 5 minutes. You can just turn to your neighbor. And what gaps do you see when it comes to the environmental justice movement in Portland, locally or beyond? And then how can we fill these in? And if you didn't see in the back, there's a little piece of paper on the wall with a sticky note on the side that you can fill out and answer the question. So if you didn't see that on your way out, it would be great if you'd like to contribute to that as well. But for now, just take a couple minutes and talk to the people next to you, and then I will wrap you back in. And I see a question in the back.
Yeah, thank you. Could you say what the bill is or the DEQ rule is that you were just talking about that there will be comments on in June?
Yes,
That
so.
will be comment on in June? Because I couldn't quite hear that.
Sorry about that. So it's Senate Bill 1567 and.
SB 1567.
Yes, 1567.
Thank you.
And DEQ's website will have a complete list of kind of the most updated information you can find. They haven't released the most updated mitigation rules yet, but they should in June when the public comment period starts.
Thank you.
Yeah, so go ahead and then I'll wrap us in a couple minutes.
Hi. Oh, you do? Okay, great. What do you think? Anyway, responsibility. And right now I talk about what gaps. We're working on this. Right now, most of the schools are doing sunrise. There's a couple of things to do.
When there's not wildfires, like are you saying that there's neighborhoods where it's already like by the glass factory? So, I mean, are you thinking about that? Yeah. Because of this, stuff there, where's it? The whole area. That's not based on the disaster, it's based on day down. Well, there was state support where we're doing something with all the high schools. I just had this big meeting with people in the 5-county region about building conditions for the county assessment, and I brought in some speakers from the Alaska Way in New York, supervisors, and I have somebody from doing some GIS work. And California's our industries are out right. URMs are dangerous. Mobile don't work.
Whoever's ready to go first, go ahead. There's a couple minutes here. Share. Up in the front.
Hi, my name is Michael. I live in the Cully neighborhood, and I'm actually in the blast zone of the oil trains coming in on the Oregon side. And there's no discussion there, and I'm a little further away, still in the blast zone. But much closer are many more people of color, communities of color, African American, indigenous, and Latino folks who live much closer than I do to the rail line. And there's nobody's willing to engage us so far. And the Cully Neighborhood Association is trying, but it's really difficult. So there's a huge environmental justice issue there. And that's miles, a few miles at least, away from the tank farm. But it's the rail line that supplies the tank farm.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
Well, we were just talking about why it's so difficult. And what we really need to do, Joan and I were just saying, like, what we really need to do is empty the tanks. I mean, there's like no doubt about it. So why is it so hard? So Joan said, all we need is a hose. That part's easy. So the issue, of course, is political will. And how do we get the politicians to get on board? And I don't know what we have to do. I mean, I have wonderful memories of how we've gotten them to do what we want in the past with major uprisings. And so I guess the question is, how do we get it together? And I think this pandemic has kind of slowed us down in that way. We really need to find ways to connect physically and to be physically making our presence heard, and not just going to a demonstration at Zenith, but be doing, a lot in the halls of power. I was putting a thing up on my website, website today from my Next Level Focus, and I've used, because it's about all the bills in front of the legislature next month. So I used a picture of the rotunda of the Capitol in November 2019, when there were hundreds of people filling the Capitol singing, "We've got the power." Yeah. And I feel like that's my mantra, and I want to get that back, and maybe we should figure out how to do that again.
Yeah, I believe that's everything. So thank you all so much for participating. I think it's always really nice when we can just talk to the people next to us. we could, maybe I can go to the last slide. Yes, okay. So again, thank you so much. If you'd like to contact me, that's my email, that's PHCC Coalition's Instagram, and our website.
So awesome, thank you. And we are right on time, you guys.
Amazing.
That's amazing. Okay, Ben, take it away.
We've got the power. I really feel like that was a great way to kick off my portion. Could we go to the next slide? Sorry. Yeah, so my name is Ben. I'm a senior in high school at Cleveland, and I'm an organizer.
Yeah!
So let's give a round of applause to every school, but I'm under 35. Come to our meetings, because there are a lot of us who are not in high school, and we still count as Seedler. And secondly, we have over 100 hubs across the country. So Portland is one of 100 hubs from New York to the Midwest that kind of are fighting for stopping climate change and creating millions of good jobs. And if you want to learn more, that's our website and social media. Okay, next slide. So my time organizing with Sunrise, I joined 4 years ago when I was a freshman in high school, has really intertwined with Zenith. So I think we have a pretty good idea of what Zenith is. Oil by rail terminal, carries oil trains right through Portland, and 1/4 of Multnomah County lives in what's called the blast zone. So if these trains derail, they would explode and threaten people who live there. So Sunrise has been involved in the fight against Zenith, and when I first joined, the first Sunrise event that I went to, I saw this photo on the right of a Stop Zenith bike ride that Sunrise helped lead. So we biked across the city, I think it was a Pedalpalooza event, and went to Zenith and did a protest. And on the left, that August, a year after I had been involved, I participated in a kayak protest. And if you haven't done kayaktivism, I'm going to give a quick plug. There's an event on June 11th out of Portland. It's super fun, and I highly recommend it. It really showed me that we can fight fossil fuels and we can have fun at the same time. So next slide. So as the fight against Zenith picked up, we met with elected officials like these, our best friends, who represent Portland and represent Oregon. So we met with Wyden, Merkley, Blumenauer, Bonamici, all of them, compelling them to urge the city, who had control over Zenith at the time, to deny Zenith's key land use compatibility permit. But they, time and again, refused to step up, refused to be climate champions, because maybe it wasn't their jurisdiction, it was the city's job, right? So we met with Carmen Rubio to no avail, we met with Dan Ryan, and I actually was in a meeting with Dan Ryan, and I asked him in 2020 if he knew what Zenith was, and he had never heard of the Zenith oil permit. So this is right before the decisions were being made. So this shows kind of what we're dealing with. And eventually, we got a big win thanks to a lot of the folks in this room, and the city denied Zenith the key permit that it needed. But then, as Margaret mentioned in the beginning, certain politicians went back on their word without consulting the public and approved Zenith's permit and have allowed it to continue operating. So you can move to the next slide. So at Sunrise, we were very frustrated, right? Because there had been all this public engagement and it defeated Zenith, but then we didn't have the power to really make that last. And so we were pissed off at City Council, and we thought, we're going to go around City Council and try to bypass these elected officials who don't serve us. So this fall and winter, we worked with partners at Breach Collective, P.E.S.T, and 350 to draft language trying to mandate the phase out of fossil fuels in Portland City Charter. And I'm going to quick shout out to Jenny O'Connor. Integral in this fight. So we sought to pass language that would go directly to the ballot and would amend Portland City Charter to require a phase out of fossil fuel infrastructure and to ban new fossil fuel infrastructure. So after months of testimony and meeting with the City Charter Commission, which is different than City Council, that's a different body, our proposal was 2 votes short of passing directly to the ballot. Only because one of our supporters had COVID, and 3 others had resigned due to passing the Charter Change 26-228 bill to restructure government. So we would have needed 15 out of 17 people on the commission to get directly to the ballot. So it was very stacked against us. We were very close, but we didn't succeed. And that's kind of where we are today. So next slide. Where does this leave us? So, yeah, we're playing whack-a-mole, right? Because with Zenith, we get a victory, and then another politician, another project, another pipeline comes to screw us over and to harm our communities. So it's like fossil fuel infrastructure whack-a-mole. But there's a sense of urgency with each mole that we whack. Each project and each development that comes up, like, there's this feeling, and I'm sure many of you have felt it, I feel it, like, we have to defeat this project. We're running out of time to fight the climate crisis. We have 7 years at this point. We have to go all in on this project, and again and again and again. And I get it, especially if we look at like what Dan brought up, what Jay brought up, what Sterling brought up, all these problems that we're facing up and down the Pacific Northwest around climate crisis. But this approach of fossil fuel whack-a-mole with all these climate villains has not worked, and it hasn't worked for me. And you can move to the next slide. Oh, that's Betsy Johnson. Yeah. That would have been bad. Yeah, so this approach of whack-a-mole, for me and for I think a lot of people in the climate movement, and especially youth, leads to burnout, and it often leads to defeat with very little to show. And then when we win, we're just on to the next project, because it just keeps coming. We got to whack down the next mole. So I've been thinking about what's another approach? How can we move past whack-a-mole? And Sunrise, as an organization, has been asking itself the same questions. So Sunrise at the national level, over the past couple of years, has gone through an extensive front-loading process to change our structure, revamp our theory of change, and our organizing strategy. And so I'm going to share today 2 key lessons that I think from Sunrise's 2.0 process, and just from thinking about this and talking to other people, 2 key lessons that I believe can help us defeat fossil fuels, get victory, and then also sustain us and maintain hope throughout the fight. So, next slide. The first lesson that I want to share is that our climate effort must become a united movement. We must really focus on building a movement. And what does that look like? First, it looks like all of us coming together like we're doing now. There's so many different efforts, whether it's all the efforts in the Columbia River, whether it's fighting the I-5 freeway expansion, which Sunrise has been involved in, right? So many different efforts that on so many different problems, and we really have to come together and unite. But there's more than just that in movement building. So you can go to the next slide. And how do we build a movement that's big enough to defeat the fossil fuel industry? We really have to focus on base building and focus on base building aggressively. And specifically, we have to base build a multiracial and cross-class movement. So one of the gaps that we mentioned in the discussion earlier that I was talking about with Dan was this room and the climate movement in Portland as a whole is very white. However, if we want to win, that has to change. And it's not just a matter of we want more diversity or that's the right thing to do. It is the imperative if we're going to win. And there's 2 reasons why. First is, in order to win, we need to get the power, right? And power principally comes from a mass of organized people. Not, as we've learned from Zenith, it doesn't come from insider politicians or influence, because they can stab us in the back when industry tells them or gives them money. So we need a mass of organized people, and to have enough people to truly have a movement that is going to be powerful enough to take on government and take on industry, we need to have people who are across different races, across different classes. And the second reason why we need to build a multiracial cross-class movement is that centering the most impacted people leads to more successful campaigns. In terms of the narrative of what are we fighting for, what are we fighting against, it's much more powerful when the folks who are most impacted by these issues are the ones who are speaking up and leading the way. So it's going to be more powerful, and more people are going to see themselves represented in this movement, which will expand our movement even more. So the first lesson is really a focus on movement building and base building a multiracial cross-class movement. You can move to the second slide, the next slide. And the second lesson is we need to center and build this movement around a positive vision. Specifically a positive vision, for Sunrise at least, of a Green New Deal world. So what is the Green New Deal? The Green New Deal is one of the core goals of Sunrise. And it's a program to combat climate change, but also address the underlying structures that cause climate change by providing good jobs in clean energy economy to BIPOC and low-income communities. And thinking back to the land acknowledgement that Margaret gave in the beginning, right? These problems of environmental extraction, of valuing profit over the land, over people, have been going on since this land has been taken. So we really need to address capitalism and address colonialism as a society. Yeah, we gotta do it if we're gonna win. We can't just decarbonize. So going back to this idea of a positive vision and of a movement that we need to build. To build a successful movement, we need to center it around this positive vision of the world. You can look at these posters. This is kind of the world we're fighting for. A world with clean energy instead of fossil fuels, with green space overtaking our cities, with affordable housing and free transit. But moreover, we have to tie our positive vision of this world of fighting climate change to immediate everyday issues like jobs, housing, transportation, and health. One narrative that we see a lot in the climate movement is this idea that our future as youth or as a planet is being destroyed. Yeah. But that doesn't speak to a lot of people. It doesn't. And that's still something that I lapse into sometimes, but it doesn't speak to people who have to pay their bills every week. You can't think beyond that. You can't think beyond rent. So by focusing on a positive vision rooted in everyday issues, we can show people how they will be benefited by climate justice policy. And then they will join our movement, and then we will have the power to defeat the fossil fuel industry. Because if they see that addressing climate change also means giving them housing, also means giving them good jobs, also means helping them get to work every day, then they will want to be involved. Okay. Next slide. So, actually, you can go one more slide. So, an example I like to look to is Illinois, and I'm not going to have time to go into detail about the Illinois Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, but in short, the Illinois Clean Energy Jobs Coalition won the nation's most ambitious and equitable climate law a few years ago after 6 years of community organizing and base building with a coalition that was led by multiracial groups. And this is kind of the blueprint for what we need to do nationwide and what we need to do here. And they started with years of listening sessions. And that's kind of the first step, is really listening to the community, right? What is this vision that we need to create? And by listening, we will help them understand their stake in this movement. And the reason this bill was passed, it was successful, was because through the years of listening sessions, it created an organized base of people who understood why this bill would benefit them. And so then when they needed people to testify, when they needed people to meet with their legislators, they showed up because they had helped create the bill in the first place. So this is how we will defeat fossil fuels. Okay, next slide. I'm running out of time. So the two things that I want you to take away from this is, first, I encourage you all to really be aggressive about base building. And this doesn't have to be in a nonprofit. It can be in your everyday life. So raise your hand if you invited somebody else to this event today. Yeah, let's give these people a round of applause. Right? And we have to be intentional about this, but even doing that, even spreading the word is the first step to gaining the movement that we need to really be successful. And second, I want to leave you with a quote from Sunrise has 12 core principles. So one of our core principles is the following quote. You can go to the next slide. And the quote is that changing the world is a joyful and fulfilling process, and we let that show. So together we will change this country and this world, sure as the sun rises each morning. So if this is your first Rumble, I encourage you to get involved. If you're under 35 and want to hang out with a bunch of cool youth, join Sunrise. If you're over 35, it's okay. You can get involved with 350 PDX. Let's go to the world we want to see together through base building and more positive vision, and let's have fun doing it.
I have to say, Ben is a guy after my own heart. I would follow you anywhere. Okay. And because I knew Ben was ending with vision and joy and a positive note, I thought I'd show one slide from our action at Zenith on April 29th, where we bloomed at the Zenith Gate. And now I get to move, I have to move over.
Thanks.
I get to talk about action. Are you ready to take action? Are you ready to build for the positive vision Ben talked about? Yeah. Are you ready to go back to the halls of power and sing, like Barbara said? Yes. So here are a few ways you can take action. One is these ways of taking action against Zenith. And on the back of your program, there is a list of decision makers you can call. You can call every single one of them and say the critical energy infrastructure hub is a problem, it needs to get fixed, and Zenith should not be operating in Portland on all levels. Go to 350's website and see if your home or workplace is in the blast zone. Join the 350 fossil fuel resistance team, or check out XR if you want to do direct action. We will be going back to Zenith as well as decision makers. Take action against the CEI Hub. Hopefully you signed in tonight so you can stay in the loop. And you can write to your representative asking for federal funding to improve storage terminal safety. And we have an emerging coalition that we're building. And Jan Zuckerman is one of our contacts, so if you're interested in helping build the movement around these particular issues, talk to Jan. Make sure you're on the list. And then there are two direct actions. This one goes right along with both what Sterling and Ben said. We've been working with Opal to stop the TriMet from raising fares, which is a huge issue for working people in Portland. And doing the outreach on the buses, the Bus Riders Unite did months of outreach. People are outraged. And so we all turned out and testified a month ago at the hearing at the TriMet board meeting. And tomorrow morning at 10:30, we're all meeting down at the north end of Waterfront Park and marching over to the TriMet board meeting, supporting the most affected people to take on the TriMet board. And you are more than welcome to join us. So that's one direct action right away. And then, Ben mentioned this, Paddle Zenith out of Portland on June 11th. Even if you're not a kayaker, it's going to be really, really fun. Cathedral Park on June 11th. Training at 9 a.m. and then a few speeches and then the action, land and water, in the afternoon. And the coalition will be talking about other actions so that all this energy we've been building up doing these rumbles, we want to put it together so that we do build that mass movement that we need. Because it's going to take thousands of people acting in concert to make change here. So, thank you. And look at that, we got about 10 minutes. We could take a few questions. Now I want them to be really questions for our panel, not your chance to make a speech, okay? But I guess, Lorraine, can you do the mic thing? And, yeah. And I think we'll have to do this. I have a question
question for Ben. I love what you were saying about base building,
Ben.
and particularly amongst people most affected. Most affected. And have you talked about how to do that? Your idea of inviting someone here is a great idea, or going door to doors. I mean, what other ideas have you got to reach those people?
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't have time to touch on the in-depth. Yeah, you mentioned going door to door. So Sunrise is launching our next campaign around transportation and climate. And so we're going to be starting that campaign with around 4 to 6 weeks of listening canvases around Portland. And so that's one way, by talking to people, we can center their voices and their concerns in our campaign, and then also bring them in and give them a stake in what we're working towards. But I think what it's really going to take is to really be intentional around targeting areas where Black and brown people in Portland live, and where low-income people in Portland live, and going to their homes, going to where people gather, and encouraging them to get involved. So I think that's one key part, is just really being intentional. And the second key part, I think, is important to focus on is our narrative. So I talked about how it's important to tie the Green New Deal, or tie climate action to issues like housing or jobs or transportation. Really having that intersectional lens and framing it not just as a fight against climate change, but a fight for having people, for lowering rent, or whatever campaign we're working on. That is going to make people feel much more seen in the climate movement, and make them feel like they can get involved, because this is something that they care about and that affects them, versus some idea of like a white teenager talking about his future.
And
I have a question for Jay. In the Japanese earthquake, they must have had tank farms all over the place. What happened to their tank farms?
Thanks for that question. It's a great analogy to look back and see for a comparable earthquake. For the most part, the events in 2011 in Japan were primarily a tsunami disaster rather than an earthquake disaster, because so much of their built environments, they've been slowly over decades building things to higher standards because they're so seismically active. And I know there were some tank ruptures, I think in Sendai, but they were contained because the soil in that area didn't fail as well. They're probably heavily engineered, but they weren't anticipating the size of the earthquake, the duration of the earthquake that they got. But of course, the worst case for them was the tsunami took down the nuclear reactor as well, and it's one reason, in an interview that I did with Barbara's program, Locus Focus, I referred to this as our Fukushima, as a cascading catastrophe that comes from an earthquake, because in some cases, or some way, the environmental consequences from this oil spill on the river going all the way downstream out into the Pacific could be decades of recovery, where we might actually recover from the earthquake much faster than we recover from the spill, the legacy of that. And so I think the big lesson for us when we look at Japan and the minimum amount of earthquake impacts that they had was the standards that they built to that we don't have in place currently for that type of earthquake. And but I think we're all in a position to take advantage of those lessons. And this is where another issue is this term that's currently in the building code community called functional recovery. I think it's a really simple, eloquent term to build things so that they're very easily restored back to service, whether that's a plant or a bridge or a house. Because most of our codes in this country are the minimal codes to avoid complete failure in an earthquake, kind of like what we saw in Turkey. But then you still can't necessarily replace it, repair it, and live in it again. It just means it didn't kill you. And I think we need to have a higher requirement for our communities, because that means people are displaced and economic disruption happens, and that you still suffer all these consequences. Even if you just could walk out of the building alive, you can't go back in the building necessarily, and that's our standard code. And so we need to ask all the low-income housing that we're getting all this infusion of money for, if we could build that to a couple of notches higher for pennies on the dollar, all those people are going to have a home to go back into after we do have our earthquake. And it's a much better investment than having to tear them down, re-extract all the resources, and build them all over again while everyone is displaced waiting on that. But that's the reality we're facing based on our current environment here, unless we change direction.
Okay, one more question here. Dana and I think, well, we'll see. Go ahead.
This is just an informational question, because I haven't been at these rumbles before. I know that there's quite a number of businesses that are at the CEI Hub, including Chevron, but I see that the focus is all on Zenith, and I'm just wondering why the focus is on Zenith and not all the other businesses.
Great. Zenith has sort of been the poster child for what's wrong, because they came into town, expanded against the will of the city, and they're the only place that brings oil in by rail. So there's all sorts of things that make it special, but they aren't the only problem. I mean, the CEI Hub itself and the fact that 90% of the fuel stored there is the other big problem. So we always talk about both issues. That's my answer on that. Dana, and then Will.
Hi, thanks. Sterling, this is a question for you. With the PHCC, could you say a few words about, are you doing base building kind of work and what that looks like?
Thank you. Yeah, so we do base building. We do a lot of different types of community activism, but base building is a really big part of it, making sure that everyone has a seat at the table that would like to be, especially tribal communities and those who have been displaced, either currently or in the past around Portland, and are still being impacted by environmental pollutants right now, or just access to the river in general. A lot of people's access has been restricted, and so, yeah, kind of all of that.
Okay, we have time for one more question. I think I saw you first.
So when it comes to the emissions from the hub, the DEQ is the responsible party. They can regulate them, they can make them monitor, etc. When it comes to the tanks themselves being on unstable soil and they should be moved and decentralized, who is the agency in Oregon that is responsible for regulating them?
Well, I'll take a first shot at that. If you check out the language that's in Senate Bill 1567, the one that currently Sterling and Nancy Heiser serve on as part of the Rule Advisory Committee, it's mostly focused within the role of DEQ for setting up the standards for the seismic assessments. But there's another section at the bottom that's for the Oregon Department of Energy to meet, and they're supposed to come up with an energy security plan for the state. And this was what I was referred back to when I went to the Oregon Global Warming Commission in September of last year and brought up the CEI Hub. Why isn't the CEI Hub in your metric for your 2050 vision? And they said, it's not related. And I said, it's the storage for all the fuel. Why aren't you tracking where it's going to be in 2050? And they said, well, you need to go talk to the people who are doing the energy security plan. And they're still, to this point, they're way behind DEQ. But they're pointing me in that direction, I guess, is if they're looking at energy security, and I'm saying security in big quotations of whatever that can mean, security may, in fact, mean decentralization. It may mean the kind of requirements for ensuring the continuity of operation of the energy infrastructure in the state, but it's not defined yet. And so I'm trying to be cautiously optimistic that there's opportunity in this new group coming in with contractors helping them run the process for coming up with that plan. But I think a lot of us could have some impact in helping to frame where do we need to go with an energy security plan. The language that's in the bill doesn't say very much about that. It just tasks the Oregon Department of Energy to do that. And so that's coming, and I'm thinking that might be a window to answer some of the question you just asked. Dan, did you want to?
Yeah, let me just add, when it comes to forward-looking, like siting of that facility down in Port Westward, that's the Army Corps of Engineers. The state of Oregon took a pass on their siting, so there's no Oregon Department of Energy, no Energy Facility Siting Council review. So the Army Corps of Engineers is going to be the one that puts out an EIS and reviews whether they want to, I kept using the term jelly soil, very scientific term, but whether they want to put, huge refinery on a peat bog. But the other thing I wanted to mention before we close, if you want to learn more about the Army Corps and their approach to Bradford Island to clean up, so Army Corps has both this issue with the new refinery, but they also have to deal with cleanup. There's a webinar in 2 days, and it's more information. I have to say that because Kate Murphy meant to be here to say it.
I meant to have that in the call to action. I forgot to put it in. One last thing, which is the next Rumble is June 28th at Central Lutheran, and we're going to be looking at Forest Park and the issues around Forest Park as part of it. So hope you can make it then. Thank you all for coming. It's great to be with you.